Today I had the great honor and privilege to interview Judy Heumann, who has been a long time disability activist. One of her biggest accomplishments was the 504 sit-in. I will be listing her other amazing accomplishments in the description below. Please enjoy the interview. Thank you. Hello, this is Scott Jewell from Scott in the System, and our guest today is Judy Heumann, longtime disability activist, and we will be going over her memoirs, Being Human, today. And thank you for coming.
You're very welcome. And before I forget, we should just let your audience know that Being Human, a memoir of an unrepentant disability rights activist, can be gotten on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or your local bookstore. It's also available on audio, and the audio has been recorded by an actor named Ali Stroker, who's the first wheelchair user to perform on Broadway, and was a Tony Award winner in 2018 for Best Revival of a Musical, and it was Oklahoma.
Was that her doing the narration?
That was Ali doing the narration.
Okay. Yeah. I must tell the audience it's very interesting.
Thank you.
Would you like to give us a background of how that started?
So I've been involved in disability rights for my whole life. I had polio in 1949.
Right.
And I got involved really because of the discrimination that I was facing growing up. And my parents, obviously before me, learned that if they weren't going to be activists for me, that I was not going to be able to achieve what they were hoping I would be able to do. And they obviously, my parents didn't know other people who had disabilities. I was born without a disability. I had polio when I was 18 months old. And they kind of, went about their life. I was in and out of the hospital, and I had therapy. And when I was 5, my mom took me to school, where the principal denied me the admission into the school because he deemed me a fire hazard, which was pretty uniformly happening to those of us who were not able to walk up and down stairs, for sure. And the Board of Ed in New York sent a teacher to my house for a total of 2.5 hours a week. And so you could tell from the very beginning that in the 1950s, if, what the system was expecting of us. And clearly 2.5 hours a week of education was something that nobody would have tolerated for a non-disabled child. But we were expected to be grateful that someone came to our home twice a week, once for an hour and once for an hour and a half. So that's really where my parents began to become activists. And as I was getting older, I recognized that I had to really take this on for myself if I wanted to really advance my life. When did you have your disability, Scott?
I have cerebral palsy, if that was not already obvious, with a speech impairment.
So you were born with your disability?
That's right, yes.
How old are you?
From what I've been told, they finally diagnosed me at 3 or 4. And they went through the gamut of Down syndrome, you name it.
What year were you born?
66.
So you were born 9 years before the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act came out.
Right, right.
So
And
you, like me, were not benefiting from that law when you were first entering school.
right, right. And I would certainly give all the credit to my folks, being they obviously advocated on my behalf, or no telling where I might be today otherwise.
Right. So I think some of the questions, Scott, that you were asking me were relating to the book. And
Right.
in the book, in the beginning, I relate a story of where we lived in Brooklyn, as I mentioned, and we lived in a middle class neighborhood, and the homes were not big. They were either individual or attached, but my friends all had steps to get into their houses. Not a lot of steps, but one step was enough, and there were usually 3 to 4 steps. And
Sure.
so one of my friends, whose name was Arlene, she lived 2 doors away. And when I would go to play with Arlene or Mary or others, we didn't have cell phones or anything like that, nor computers. So, you would just go knock on your neighbor's door
Right.
and say, oh, could so-and-so come out and play? But I couldn't knock on my neighbor's door. So the story in the book explains that I would ineptly push my wheelchair because I didn't have motorized wheelchair at that time because they hadn't been invented. And
Really?
would call for my friend. So I would call Arlene, can you come out and play? And I guess you asked me this question of why did my mother not do it? And I guess because it was like a habit of what happened now, because I would call and people would hear me. It wasn't a noisy neighborhood. And then either Arlene or her mother or father or somebody would come to the door and say, yes, she can, and she'll be out, or no, she can't.
Right.
So, why my mother didn't do it, she didn't need to do it. And I guess that was also a way for me to begin asserting my independence
Right.
or learning how to do that.
So we could say it was almost a metaphor what you were going to face later in life.
Uh-huh. Yeah, good. Then you also asked me, so there's another scene in the book where Arlene and I are off our block. We're going around the corner to the candy store, and a boy comes up to me and asks me, are you sick? And your question to me was, are you sick? Did that change my vision of the world? I think, it's a good question because in many ways, it began to change my vision of, well, maybe I didn't have a vision at that point, in as much as I was just a kid in the neighborhood, kid in the family. And I knew that I was different because I didn't walk and I used a wheelchair, but like my brothers and my friends didn't talk to me like I'm sick. So this person that I didn't know coming over to me and asked me if I was sick, that really was like a rude awakening, that people who didn't know me viewed me as sick. And if you read the book, you'll see that I devote a couple of pages to this part of my life where I was like reflecting on how people saw me and how I saw myself. And so I would say that that point in my life also was very important because in a rude way, it began my thinking about how others saw me and how I saw myself. And I think that's something in many ways, that we're still addressing because of the handicapism, ableism, that still exists. And I'm sure you have the same experience.
Oh, yes, my personal favorite is when I'm in public with my wife or someone else, and somebody will come up and ask a question, but they'll ask them instead as if I'm not capable of speaking for myself or what have you.
Big problem for me also. People who will talk to the person I'm with as opposed to talking to me. I came I came from St. Louis to San Francisco a number of years ago on an airplane. I was traveling with a friend of mine on business, and we get off the plane last, and we were waiting and waiting, and someone comes on the plane and doesn't say to me, but says to my friend, very clearly to my friend, her wheelchair has been destroyed.
Oh boy.
And it wasn't just that it was destroyed, but it was the fact that they didn't even have the common sense to realize it was my wheelchair. I was on an airplane. They were treating me exactly like you said, like we're not there. And that's this, continual issue. Here we are in 2020 and celebrating the 30th anniversary of the ADA, and yet some of our stories are the same stories that we told before the ADA and before 504. This inability for some people to see us like they see themselves. Another question here about why was therapy so important compared to education? So I would not say for me that therapy was at all more important than education. Therapy was something that I was getting when I was younger. And when I went to the special ed classes, therapy was a part of what was going on. And in my mind, it took away from our education. And the therapies were important, but we should have maybe stayed in school an extra hour or on the weekend or different things. But education, therapy to facilitate our learning and our ability to be as independent as possible in the community, I think is important, but education is always the most important.
Yes, yes, I got therapy up through 6th grade, and when I transferred to our local school system, uh, I had it for a while, but it was eventually phased out within a year or two.
Right.
I wish it would have continued, but I guess it was probably lack of funding or time or combination of the both.
Mm.
Yeah.
Do you still get therapy?
No, I don't, honestly, and I haven't for years. I'm not too proud to say that, but being with home health care, they really don't add that into your needs for assistance per se.
Sometimes you need to ask your doctor about it.
Yeah.
They can get it sometimes,
Added on. Okay.
depending on your plan. A
Yeah.
whole other discussion.
Yeah.
So you have a couple other questions here. How did other students treat me? I mean, certainly my disabled friends, we all treated each other equally. And I didn't live in the neighborhood that I went to school in, either for elementary school or high school. In university, I lived on campus. So, how did they treat me? I would say I never experienced bullying, which I know many disabled people do. and I was in a sorority, and so I did many things with the sorority and fraternity. But I felt completely a part of the disability community. The non-disability community was, still like now, and like anything, I guess, you're looking for individual people that you can be friends with. And overall, my experiences on the college campus were positive experiences, although I really wasn't able to integrate as much as others because the city, the trains weren't accessible, the buses weren't accessible. So I couldn't just, go about like other people would be doing. So it really did restrict a lot of my ability to socialize. I did have a scoliosis. I did wear crutches and I did wear braces. And, in order to address my scoliosis, and I did have surgery.
Oh, I do have Harrington rods full length.
So do I.
Oh, guess we got something in common.
Exactly. How many do you have?
What's that?
How many do you have?
I want to say two. To
I have
give
three.
the quick story, I was the first one to have the Lukey method, assuming that was the name of the doctor who did it, meaning they went in from the back only and put the rods on each side and wrap the spinal column and the rods all at one time.
Uh,
Where priorly you had to go in from the front as well 2 weeks later.
yeah, mine only were in the back,
Yeah,
and I have three.
yeah,
I had two
okay.
procedures.
Well, mine was about a 7 or 8 hour surgery, as I recall.
Yeah. And so I had my surgery in the 60s,
Yeah.
and I was in the hospital for the first time a month. And when I came back in to change the cast, I guess for a couple of weeks.
Were you in a full body cast?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I was too. Yeah.
yeah.
That was 1980 for me.
I was 1968.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
you wanted to know how I got around Brooklyn. Well,
Yeah.
at that time, I either not very well. My father had a van because he had a butcher store. So
Right.
I would get around in the van or when I was younger in the car. But I never drove, and the buses, as I said, and the trains were not accessible at that point. So getting around was something that I was truly dependent on other people to help me with. And my support system was really my family and friends. I had one person in college who helped me in the morning and at night. And outside of that, it was really, friends on campus that would help me get from class to class, help me go to the bathroom during the day. And yeah, then as I said, the person who would help me in the morning or at night and night.
And, and that was way before we had, personal care attendants and all that stuff.
Right, right. And then you asked me a bunch of questions about California and the 504 demonstrations. So maybe I can give you a little bit of information. A normal day when I was at Berkeley at the university is someone would come in the morning and help me get up, get dressed, get ready, and I would go to school and I would walk because there were no accessible buses yet in Berkeley, and I would walk from my apartment to the campus. And then there was a disabled students office, and during the day, if I needed to go to the bathroom, I would go to the disabled students office for someone to help me. And I was also involved at the Berkeley Center for Independent Living. I was on their board, so I was doing work with them. So it was, going to school, studying, being involved with CIL. That was what was going on. That was kind of a typical day. When did I discover my first curb cut? Well, I discovered my first curb cut as a driveway, right?
Oh.
I mean, the driveways in neighborhoods allowed a car to get up, over the sidewalk to a garage or wherever it was parking. So that was really my, when I was growing up, because there were driveways in the neighborhood. I'd go to the corner and I couldn't get across the street like everybody else because there was a step. But if I went down the driveway, I could ride in the street. And I did that for many, many years. My first curb cut, probably in New York, because New York was doing curb cuts. Berkeley was doing, they were fighting for curb cuts there. So I think, curb cuts have become more ubiquitous here and in other countries slowly because of laws and demands of the disability community. So I guess I discovered the first curb cut, as I said, that wasn't a curb cut, but a driveway when I was a baby.
Yeah, well, of course, that was like playing chicken for us in wheelchairs. Here we are out in the shoulder of the road or what have you. That could get a little dangerous, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I used to take voice lessons in Manhattan, and I would drive from West 110th Street to West 92nd Street in the street. So that was on very Madison Avenue or Amsterdam Avenue. Very, very, very busy streets with trucks and buses and cars. And I did that every year for a number of years for 2 weeks so that I could get to my classes. Then you've got a series of questions that deal with things around 504. So 504 for the audience is an anti-discrimination provision that came about in 1973. And it says that if you are a disabled individual and the entity gets money from the federal government, that it cannot discriminate against you based on your disability. There had been a lot of work that was being done around the United States in getting this law drafted into regulations. And when I was now at the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, starting in 1976, I'd gone to graduate school in 1973. In 1974, I'd come to Washington to work for a senator. And from 1974 until December of 1975, I lived and worked in Washington. Then I left and I came back and I went to Berkeley and started working at the CIL in 1976. And I was on the board of an organization called the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities. And we, through ACCD, had been doing a lot of work on getting regulations written and being involved in working on getting those regulations signed by the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. And for those of you who have seen a movie called Crip Camp, it's on Netflix, called CRIP, CAMP, that gives you a lot of good information about the 504 demonstrations. There's also a piece on YouTube called The Power of 504, which is an 18-minute documentary on the 504 demonstrations. A number of the people that you asked me about here, who was Kitty Cohn? Kitty Cohn was a very dear friend of mine. She worked at the CI, Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. She was an activist. She did work on organizing and transportation and advocacy. And she was one of the key leaders of the 504 demonstrations. She was a wheelchair user. She had a form of muscular dystrophy. And unfortunately, a number of years ago, she died from cancer.
Yeah.
Ed Roberts, as many of you may know, is also one of the leaders of the independent living movement, and I think very much recognized as a person who was a change agent. I mean, Ed had polio when he was 14. He went to the University of California, Berkeley. He wanted to live on campus. He used an iron lung. They made him live in the hospital, the college hospital. And he then went on with some friends to start the Disabled Students Office at UC Berkeley, and then the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. And then Ed also was the director of the Department of Rehabilitation in California, where actually he worked very closely with a gentleman named Don Galvin. And Don Galvin was the former director of the Department of Rehabilitation in Michigan. And Don and Ed did a lot of work together, supporting and fostering the development of the independent living movement. And Ed put funding, federal funding, into setting up 10 centers for independent living when he was the state director. And Don used some of the Michigan money to set up 1 or 2 CILs at that time also. So Michigan is the state that I went back and forth to a number of times with doing some work with Don and with a gentleman named Pete Griswold, who was the deputy for Don and then later became the director of the Michigan Department of Rehabilitation.
Well, that makes me kind of feel good being I'm obviously from Michigan.
Right, exactly. That's what I was mentioning. And Pat Wright and I started working together around 1976, 77. She later, well, in the beginning, she was working with me. She was traveling with me. She was a thought leader as well as helping me with my personal assistance. She later went on to work for the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, opened up their office in Washington, D.C., and was one of the key people behind the Americans with Disabilities Act. She's retired now, but she is an amazing strategist, was highly respected within the community because she was strategic. She also was a forceful person who, if you had to reckon with her, you really had to recognize that the likelihood of her winning was pretty significant. So I really have been very honored to call her a friend of mine. My reaction to Comedy Central. So Drunk History is a program, it's unfortunately not been renewed, but Drunk History did a piece on 504. For those of you who know Drunk History, as you were saying, Scott, Drunk History is on Comedy Central. And unfortunately, they've only done one piece on disability. And they did it on the 504 sit-in. And I mentioned earlier on Ali Stroker, who's read my book. Well, Ali and I met each other because she was the person who played me in the Drunk History piece. So it's Drunk History 504. It's a story about the 504 demonstrations, and Ali played me in that. So there were some inaccuracies in the script, but overall I felt it was a really great production because it was part of a program that was about history. And Drunk History does 3 different pieces each time it airs. And so the day that I was on, or 504 was on, the first piece was on a suffragette. The second piece was on a high school student who led the Selma High School walkout. And then the third piece was the 504 demonstration. So for people who know Drunk History, I really encourage you to go to YouTube and see it. Just put in Drunk History in YouTube, Drunk History 504, and it'll come up. And then you ask a question about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So for your audience, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is probably the most important document internationally. It was adopted by the United Nations, and why that was very important is because most countries in the world belong to the UN, and it's an opportunity for people to come together. Not, the outcomes are not necessarily what the United States always likes, but nonetheless, it's a convening force. And what was very important about the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was that disabled people from all over the world came together a number of times a year between 2002 and 2006. They were meeting with their formal delegations from their countries and talking about discrimination against disabled people and looking at putting together a treaty that would articulate not only what the problems were, but what governments needed to do if in fact they signed on to adopt the convention. In many ways, it's a similar, not the same, but a similar document to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And all but 2 or 3 countries have signed. Unfortunately, the US is not one of them. It's my sincere hope that if Vice President Biden becomes the president, that the CRPD will be able to move forward. We need to get the Senate, 2/3 of the Senate, to recommend ratification to the president. In the Republican-controlled Senate, when I worked at the Department of State, it was not possible to get them to support this. But if we all work hard and get back the Senate and the White House, I feel confident that we would be able to get the CRPD ratified, which in many ways is so very important because it would enable us in the United States to really be engaging more on the international scene with other governments, sharing information on what we've been doing, learning from other countries what more we could be doing. And I think really, right now we're very marginalized, very sidelined. We're not participating in a way that I think really is imperative for the US to do, because we've been able to make changes in our country that many others have not yet achieved. We have much more to go, as we all know, but I think we should be proud of what we've done and how we've done it and share that with others. And I think the last question that you had, Scott, is after all the accomplishments that I've made, what do I see as the next steps for the disability rights movement? So I think for the next steps, I believe we need to continue to expand our movement. We have 61 million disabled people in the United States, 1 billion disabled people around the world. What we need to do is listen to the stories of disabled people with all types of disabilities from all different racial and religious and sexual orientations. Listen to people's stories, learn about the barriers they've been facing, learn about solutions and how things have been working, look at stronger enforcement of our laws. I think it's also really important that we need more extensive legislation in the area of home and community-based services or long-term services, so that people like yourself and myself, I work, and I have savings, so I'm unable to get any help from the government for my personal assistance, and I'm spending a minimum of $50,000 a year in order to cover my expenses.
Wow.
And yeah, it's, I've worked hard, we've saved, but nonetheless, ultimately, we want to ensure that the disability community in the US is growing, is more unified, and I think that we are also expanding our areas of concern, such as in the school to prison pipeline, because of the number of disabled people, not exclusively, but significantly of color, with mental health disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and we need to be identifying kids at risk much earlier on to make sure that the laws that are out there to protect them, in fact, are being implemented now. And we also need for us as a community to be speaking up and out in a more forceful way about the barriers we're experiencing, working on expanding our own movement and getting other movements to be joining us. So that to me is, and getting through COVID. And I think getting through COVID is more than just addressing the issue of suppression of the virus through vaccines, but COVID itself obviously is having a significant impact on all aspects of our lives: work, transportation, healthcare. And we need to make sure that we as disabled people are at the table as the federal government, state, local government, and private sectors are moving forward. We need to be a part of those discussions.
In short, could you tell the viewers why the United States does not wish to ratify the Convention for Rights of those with disabilities?
I would say every Democrat voted for it.
Okay.
We were only able to get 6 or 7 Republicans.
Okay. So it's like a partisan issue.
Yes, where disability has always been bipartisan, I think, yes.
Okay. In theory, you would think we would be the first. Instead, it had to be that way.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
I really want to thank you for asking to interview me. It's been great.
Yeah, you have no idea how much I appreciate what you've done for folks like myself and others.
I appreciate that. Here is the book cover. It says, Being Human, an Unrepentant Memoir of a Disability Rights Activist. I also have a program called The Human Perspective, HEUMANN, on YouTube, and people can follow me on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So thank you very much, Scott. All right, I appreciate this a lot, Scott.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. And Scott, maybe you can send us a copy of the recording.
Oh, yes, ma'am, I'll do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good day now.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Yeah, bye.